Hello folks, in this video we will run through how to design, draw, and understand how to paint waterfalls, cascades, and swirling water in the environment. There will be lots of tips using diagrams, video clips, and photos, but it's also very informative, so let's get going. First, here's a quick reference photo, but as we go along you'll see how much I'll change it to make the painting and the techniques of painting fit what the site looks like. As we get going here, you'll be able to see how the design firms up and how the drawing block in will influence the final painting. It's a fairly complex scene, so what I do is I chunk it up a little bit. I simplify all those rock forms down to really simple shapes. Same thing with the little escarpments in the back, and even the water, I'll chop it into pieces just so I understand how everything's going to fit into the composition, and it'll give me time to think about what the ultimate objective will be. Then you see I take those initial forms and then start cutting pieces and adding pieces onto them. So in the previous videos we talked about perspective and how the relatively flat layers of water has to fit on top of that and look like it's cohesive. So one thing I'll do is that I'll make sure I just design the pools first. You can see those big open spaces that are designed into. Same thing with the little waterfalls and cascades, that even goes for giant waterfalls, is I'll take those shapes and simplify them down so there's more design rather than trying to draw the little ripples and things. A lot of what we're going to be doing will be suggesting these forms rather than working in with all the little fussy details that are going to get in the way of the final presentation of it. Perhaps you'll notice that the design is really important, so I make sure I keep that stair-step effect. And then when I'm drawing the spray or the water foam or whatever in here, that again I keep it flowing and the motion going in it, so it's again very understandable as I start to paint it. I know the drawing's a general guide and I'm going to be obliterating it in the future. Hopefully you'll see that connection as we move into the video clips. Also, an important point here is to realize that I'm drawing this much more detailed than I usually would, and I'm also drawing the lines a lot harder than I normally would, because I know I'll be painting over the top of it, but I also notice that I want everybody to see how it's constructed first before I launch into painting. So now I'm going to fade into the diagram so you can see its effect on the drawing and how I use it as an organizing principle to keep everything in line and keep all the distances and the proportions right. So even though it's a painting about water, I'm going to be using these rocks in here to kind of corral the action that goes on. I won't be spending a lot of time illustrating them out, but just acknowledging them so they'll be able to frame the actual motion of the water later. So to paint the rocks, I'm favoring the warm light coming in from the right hand side and cooling off the general mixture of raw sienna with a little bit of orange and white paint with some ultramarine blue to kind of cover the more shadowy areas away from the light on the left hand side of the stones. I'm using a flat 1/2 inch brush, making sure I keep my edges really under control and make sure that the rocks don't get too soft and rounded at this point. I'm going to be sort of playing off the fluidity of the water and the roundness of that, along with the squareness and more angularity of the rocks later. So it's at this point where it's really important to sit back and analyze your subject matter if you're sitting there. And what this is kind of hard to see in the reference photo, but because of the refraction, the ability to be able to look through the water at this steep angle, I can see the individual stones that are more colored in a golden and brown orange hue here, and be able to lay those in knowing that I'm going to come over the top of it with layers of ripples and reflections later. I'm painting fairly quickly here, But at the same time, you might notice that subconsciously, or just through lots of painting, I keep the stones different size and do a lot of overlapping on them so they don't become monotonous, but they also go with the perspective of the pool and the way they sit on the inside to reinforce the space that's there. Now I'm coming in and adding the ripples on top of those stones, and as you can see in the diagram above, it might look a little complicated, but you have to really kind of weave all of those ripples together so they don't become too jarring and too abrupt and disconnect from one another. I am ultimately trying to draw the force and movement of that water. Now a quick little switch over from my palette to the painting for comparison. First, an overview of the pools of color on my palette. Notice how ultimately they do mix together, but each area has its own little pool that I can separately dip into and then add into the painting and then color mix across them. So I'm painting this dance between the idea of the reflections coming off the tree, which are the greener colors, the color of the water, which obviously is a bluish part, and then that refraction of looking down into the creek and seeing the stones underneath the water. I bring up that diagram because ultimately I'm moving back to the pattern and the movement of the water from the left-hand side to the right. I'm skipping around the painting because I want to make sure that I keep the white version parts of the paper clean, because I'm frankly nervous about once I go over the top of that, no matter how much white gouache I put over the top to fix it, it's not going to be able to pull back to the original whites of the paper. So I'm giving those wrinkles, those ripples in it a lot more space and building around it. By using those light strokes and that broad paintbrush and doing some dry brushing on it, I can use that to sort of hint at the ripples being a lot, I will say, wider and flatter, and then come over the top of them with more thinner, more defined strokes later on in the painting when I'm more sure about what kind of rhythm that I want to build up and what sort of direction and force I want to portray in the water using those thinner strokes as almost like arrows to point the eyes in a certain direction. So when drawing your painting, falling water and cascades, here's a technique that I use. Since this is simulating plein air painting, one thing that I do first is watch the water falling so I can see the shape of the design fall and how to best represent the motion and force of the water. Just like a camera at different speed settings. So I don't want this to get lost in a bunch of vertical lines that look like hair. What I want to do is I want to make sure I keep that shape to represent the, say, the front part of a staircase. And so you see the verticality of it coming off the horizontal ponds in the background, rather than worrying about people understanding that that's rushing water. Hopefully the viewer's brain will put that in and understand the abstractness of what you're painting. Perhaps you'll notice in the ponds above and below that the marks are horizontal and the strokes for the cascades are more on the vertical side. The colors representing the reflection of what's above it. The darker lines are that little caves in behind the falls that the water, as it condenses at the bottom, break apart and show. And you can see the rhythm of those strokes going across from one side to the other and then underneath the shadows and the rocks. That builds a continuity and cohesiveness that moves you from one side of the composition to the other, from one side of the cascade or waterfall to the other, so your eye doesn't get stuck on tiny little details. What I just got done doing there is painting the reflections of the forest and the canopy up above the pond. Even as I put those strokes in, I make sure that I don't pollute that falling water in the background or that swirling water in the pond right underneath it. I don't want to make sure that that gets lost, even as I'm putting in these little reflective areas. It's still about the continuity and understanding that perspective as you move up from the large pond to the medium pond to the small, very, very thin pond at the top. About this time, I'm about halfway in, and I've sort of blocked everything out in a very, very mid-tone. Using the mid-tones, it sort of allows me to have a little breathing space so I can organize the chaos of this, get it all blocked out, get the design set up well. And then I'm coming in here and blocking in these darker areas to kind of define the rocks from the other area, or just maybe the shadows from the other area. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the rocks and stones and boulders, but I certainly want them delineated so you'll be able to see the borders between the water that I'm painting and the forms that surround it. Mixing up a little bit of Windsor green with some burnt umber, getting a nice dark there. I'm now putting in the shadowed areas by the rocks underneath, and then pushing those bigger strokes to show the force of the water coming towards us. Having said that and watching the video, you can see how much I'm trying to really stay away from where those eddies and that white water's coming up in front of that falls in the front. I really do not want to screw that shape up, so the darks that I'm using, now that I'm putting a little bit more of sort of a raw sienna in there, I'm going to slowly move those darker areas into where that shape is, rather than taking the chance of going in there with a real dark area, even though I may see one at this point, and screwing up the pattern of that swirling water. By the way, that raw sienna represents a darker pattern of stones that are underwater, mixing in with the other golden stones that I painted before. At this point, I feel a little bit more confident about what I'm doing, so now I'm going to start to put in more idea of texture on the rocks, a little bit more idea of the light logic, where the light's coming from the right-hand side of the picture, and even that texture on the rock in the back. You can see I started with a fairly dark mixture, and as more paint I use, the less paint obviously is on the brush, so I can kind of go in there and dry brush to get a little bit more the idea of the surface texture of the stone. So now I'm ramping up to getting ready to do the smaller ripples, the more swirling part of the painting. So to pull order out of the chaos, this is a diagram that I use to keep my brain wrapped around it. My organizing principle is the main direction that the water's flowing in, the main force of it. So this is where the real dance begins. The stones under the water, the larger push of the bigger areas, then into these smaller little ripples and larger ripples, and finally the stones up above the surface of the water. Getting these all to work together as a design is extremely important. Remember, ultimately it's your responsibility in the fact that you're going to have to take all these short-handed strokes, pull them together, and give your viewer the idea of what you want them to see in relationship to the force and the direction and the action of the stream that you're painting. I have to admit it's a personal bias on my account, but I really don't use any black in putting this together, even though it looks like really dark ripples there. I'm using a combination of some purples and blues, even some browns and greens in there, mixed with complementary colors to push those darks. I'm also using a pretty supple dagger brush here that's got a very thin edge in the front, just like the sound of it is, and that way I can also push it to the side and get a broad stroke. And it's got a pretty good well. It keeps a lot of paint on the inside of it. One of the big mistakes I can see is I've got a little bit too much dark areas in the front that's having a tendency to make it a little bit too high contrast. But that's the beauty of gouache, is I can come over later and paint some lighter, more impasto strokes over the top of it. Boy, it really is insane how much I have of that first level red line design I have at the beginning of the video to keep me organized through this so I don't lose my way and clog up those swirling pools with a bunch of unnecessary strokes and lines. So I don't want your eye to get stuck on any specific part of it, so you may notice that I take the strokes, or let's call them the ripples, go from large, medium to small, and interweave the concave and convex lines together, the thin strokes with the thick strokes, and frequently putting down broad, lighter strokes and then slamming thin, darker ones right over the top of them and making sure that they flow together but don't contradict one another. And an idea I always return to is the fact that no matter what I see and all the visual stimuli I'm getting, I'm still putting together a story about the scene that I'm painting. So what I have to do is take different areas, and sometimes, like right now, I'm painting in the shadows underneath the rocks with ultramarine and a little bit of cobalt. And again, not outlining them so much, but just accenting one side where the shadow is, and then maybe coming into another area and painting the thinner ripples. and then taking the other area, like the upper part where the falls are, and then just keeping that shape design there so the viewer can pick up all this information from scanning the entire picture and, in a sense, put pictorial calmness to it, and understanding to it, that they can take away and be able to pick up all these different elements in nature and make a narrative out of it. The cool part about it is that you can take these elements and abstract them down to like very, very specific sort of areas and still get across the fact of what you're painting, even though obviously you're not copying the source material, whether you're sitting and looking at a photograph or painting it in nature. In fact, this takes a lot of the panic out of it, that you're able to realize that all you have to do is hint at a lot of stuff and the viewer will pick up the visual information from the way that you put it together. So I just got done putting in the shadows, a little bit more of the dark contrast there, accenting some of the sharper edges on stuff. And now to kind of pull it together a little bit more, I brought in some cobalt blue with a little bit of white. I'm going to add sort of some of the sky reflections and pull some of the areas together and also bring down some of the contrast in those busy areas in the water. Now here's one of those sections that you plan for way and way in back of the drawing. And me, as in painting it darker, knowing I'm going to be putting these little splashes over the top of, which are, about the size of a fingernail here. But what I'm doing here is putting those little splashes in, thinking about, again, how much water's coming down, what it's coming off of, and taking that brush and kind of twisting it around a little bit, and even taking, you'll see my finger and pushing a little bit. And those little reflections on the top of it showing the water starting to turn from the horizontal to the vertical. Now we're getting to the end of the painting, and I'm bringing in some white impasto gouache paint right out of the tube practically and going over the top of the painting. Now I knew a lot of these areas that I was painting it too dark on purpose because I wanted it to jump on top of the painting, make it look like those lit glints of light that are going off the ripples. You see, I'm also using sort of a dry brush technique so it doesn't overwhelm and sit on top of the painting so much. But again, it just sort of adds to the rhythm of the eye flow as you move through and get the idea of that light coming in more intensely from the right-hand side. I'm making sure that these little dots of paint represent the light glints in a sort of organized randomness for visual impact. Again, these last little glints of white gouache painting I'm putting in there is to clear up stuff like the splashes, a few little glints here and here, but mostly, again, it's the idea that you're acknowledging the very top surface of the painting that you're looking at. And we'll go in for a few final little close-ups to show you sort of abstract and solid areas of the painting before I pull back and show you the whole composition. And I'll bring in a reference photo so you can make a comparison between the two and see how many changes I've made. When you're painting water, just like painting clouds, you're going to have to make a lot of changes and a lot of decisions about making it more understandable than copying. So now let's pull out of the center to the whole composition and see what it looks like. Here's a side-by-side comparison. And here's with the painter's tape pulled off and filling the whole screen, so you can see perhaps a little bit more of the details and information and implied textures. It might represent a painting that's a little bit more busy than my usual water painting, but I threw the kitchen sink at it just so you can see all the different kind of techniques and methodologies and even diagrams that I put into it, or thinking processes. Hopefully using these organizing principles will help you put together your own paintings in the future. So before I go, thanks very much for watching the video, and feel free to leave a comment and hit the like button. And here's my contact information before, where you can see more of my artwork, and I'd like to thank you very much, and adios and goodbye. See you later.